Hi, friends. That was fun. So it was. I didn't really think through how different that was going to be as an experience from like a typical play-by-play. Um, just based on the fact that like it's a multiplayer game. It's been a while since we did play-by-play together or anything with like real actual people. I have gotten used to this being such a solitary experience. Uh, uh, so I had a blast. I hope you guys also had fun. But we didn't get to talk as much about the game sort of as we were playing it, which is fine. It was fun to play, and hopefully it was fun to watch. And now we can talk about stuff. So if you guys have any questions, if there's stuff that sort of you were thinking about, or you want to hear my thoughts on as a player, or you want to talk to the developers, Michelle and Will. I think Michelle is also, yes, Michelle and Will are both in the chat, and so I can help read for posterity their answers to questions. But let's just start. There are a couple of questions in here. Starting, of course, with is there a dragon cyborg bot? It's an enormous oversight that in my finish and polish class that I teach with Jesse, we do not insist that all games add a dragon, because as we've seen in like 90% of cases, adding a dragon improves the quality of a game in theoretical models that we run on Thursday nights, just kind of based on absolutely nothing. So that's my bad. Sorry. I could have insisted. I could have staked somebody's grade on that, and I didn't. And so there are not dragons in the game. It's interesting. Like, I don't know. We don't do a lot of card games on play-by-play, even though I do a lot with card games in my real life. And it is harder to introduce dragons in sort of the more, I'm going to say, complex or oblique ways that we sometimes talk about. I think that dragons in Robottery 101 or Robottery 102, guys, if you're looking for a follow-up game or an expansion pack, dragons would be a purely aesthetic addition. That said, there is a large part of this game that is aesthetic, that is about not just putting together a mechanically sound or a systemically sound, I guess, a robot that is going to score you specific points, but also putting together a robot that you think looks cool. And for me, that was a lot more about pose and color combination than the specific cards. But I know that like we did talk about specific cards. We talked about especially like sword hands versus drill hands versus gun hands. And I gotta imagine that dragon cards would be in high demand just from an aesthetic perspective. Also, I mean, if we're seriously talking about expansion packs, like I can see ways that dragon cards could introduce new mechanics to the game. For example, what if there were like optional wing limbs, and your robot could have wings, it doesn't have to have wings, and maybe wings count as limbs in some cases, and don't count as limbs in other cases when we're judging professors. I don't know exactly how that would go. You'd have to think through exactly how the professors deal with that. But if we change, wings would change potentially the number of limbs that a robot can have. So that's something that you could do that would be kind of crazy. Okay. Sorry. Questions. Seems like okay. This is a great one. Great question. It seems like the game would end in a lot of ties. How well do you think it handles them with the guest professor? It seems like the randomness could be frustrating. I would love to hear Michelle and Will, your answer to this. So the first part of it is in the game that we just played, the scores were pretty tightly clustered, which in general is good because it means that in games where you have a big spread in scores, it often means that there are balance issues. Clustered scores tend to be good, but they do mean that ties are more common. So how common are tie scores, actually? And then in your experience playtesting the game, how effective and how satisfying is the guest professor mechanic? Does it seem to reward a player for something that they actually do more times than not? What I'm going to say is that it's a mechanic that rewards players who are very familiar with the game. Because if you know what the scoring criteria of face-down professor cards are, then you can at least build your robot with an eye towards not only scoring as many face-up cards as you can, but also then putting yourself in a position to score face-down cards so that when one of them gets flipped, you have a better chance of being the winner. That requires like a lot. It requires a lot of luck, and it requires that you be really, really familiar with all of those professor cards. So, how much is that sort of a real issue? It's hard for me to judge because I have not played the game as much as the developers have. They've done a ton of playtesting of this game in order to try to sort out some of these issues. I think this is Will. I'm pretty sure this is Will. Yeah. Will says that they definitely came across a lot of ties in playtesting and had to tweak accordingly. So, did those tweaks help make ties less common? We only had one professor worth 4 points, which are usually tougher to get and help with ties. However, the closeness in scores has always been something that's a challenge to overcome. Says Michelle. So yeah, that's true. We had a field that was 4 professors that were worth 2 points and only one professor that was worth 4. I'm actually curious. I don't know what the distribution of those points in professor cards is. Michelle or Will, if you have that just on hand, how many cards are there of different values of points? So one thing that's sort of coming to mind thinking about this in terms of the wanting to reduce the amount of randomness. I don't know. It's tough. It's Uh, yes. Okay. Okay. Great. Okay. So I'm gonna say the thing that I was gonna say, which it is. I'm going to say sort of in the same way that I would talk about any other game that I play on Play by Play. It's late in the production to make these kinds of changes, but I'm curious actually like how much playtesting with this sort of thing you did. One thing that you could do in like a house rule kind of a thing, if it was effective, would be to have the guest professor flipped face up so that players can see who the guest professor would be. But the guest professor is not a regular professor. It can't be won by just anybody. It only comes into play if there is a tie. And if there is a tie, then the guest professor judges between the players who are tied, which might sort of having a card that is there specifically for the smaller pool of players who are trying to break the tie might still create enough diversity in the points like that it might be difficult for both of those players to tie their scores and also get that professor. But it increased the chance that you also tie in the tiebreaker. And then I guess you would have to draw another card. I'm going to go back to Michelle, who is typing a lot about this. Recent playtests, we haven't encountered as much need for guest professors because we doubled the scores of the professor cards and diversified their qualifications and preferences. Often, there are more professors who want different things. So this is sort of a great way of thinking about how you fix that problem. When there were a lot of ties in the game, the scores were clustered really, really close together. A way to try to fix that is to put in mechanisms that artificially, I mean, I say artificially, just artificially, like, because it's all designed, that expand the distance between those scores, right? So that make it less likely that clustered scores are actually going to overlap in a way that creates ties. So doubling everything by itself doesn't necessarily fix things, although if you also then, just doubling everything doesn't help, but doubling all of the base points and then going in and tweaking things so that there are more likely to be variations in final scores will create a wider field of final scores. So I think that's a really good approach to solving that problem. And again, like, we played this game and it felt like the scores were pretty tightly clustered, but you have to look at this, this is true of tabletop games and digital games, but it's easier to see, it's easier to sort of grasp and think about in tabletop games. This particular game, was this a game where scores were more clustered than they usually are? In which case, having them be this clustered is fine. And then in a typical game, scores are a little bit more spread out, and so there's less likely to be a tie. And so in the course of, in the field of all possible games, you're going to have sort of some where the scores are really clustered and there are ties, and a lot where the scores are less clustered, and in a small percentage of those there will be ties, but most of those there won't be ties. So you have to sort of think about the probability over a large range of games, and then also think about the experience design at those fringes. So in the worst case, where the professors that we get are all the most similar professors that exist, so the scores are going to be the most clustered that they ever are. And then in that case, if there are, if there is a tie or there's a larger tie, or like what's the worst case outcome of that, making sure that the game still functions. Even if that's not the optimal play experience, it can't break the play experience. And I actually think the idea of the guest judge, like, there is an amount of randomness in this game. This is not a pure strategic game. It is thematically appropriate, and it helps sort of reinforce the fact that there's sort of a casualness to this. That casualness helps players express the doll housing of the robots a little bit more in this game than you do in a typical board game, and certainly in a game that is really focused on strategic play to the exclusion of all else. Yeah, okay, so Eve, I'm going to come back to... Eve just had a suggestion that I'm going to come back to. Do you think this game could be modified to work with different numbers of players? Guys, help me. Did you have a version of this that worked with more players? I can't remember. I guess maybe you didn't. Yeah, so this is tough. The variable number of players is a really, really difficult design constraint when you're making a tabletop game. It doesn't seem like it should be, and it's also there's enormous market value placed on having a game that can play with a variety of different player configurations, right? So if your game can only play with 4 players, then it's harder to get a group together to play it than if it can also be played with 3 or 5 players, right? And so that game is sort of less marketable because it is less, it's just going to be played less often. It's seen as a lower value. So it's got to be a good game to still be able to convince somebody that they want to have it and be able to play it, in the case where they, even though they're not going to be able to play it all the time. So for that reason, when you go to a game store, there are, most of the games that you will see on the shelves have variable numbers of players, allow for a variable number of players. It's just, that's the way the marketing for those games works out. That becomes a design constraint for game developers, but it's actually like a big challenge. And so it's something that in the sort of limited time that our students have to develop these games, let me just sort of walk you through what this how this game came to be. This was developed entirely in significantly less than a year, over the course of 2 semesters at USC. The first semester is a class called Game Design Workshop for undergraduate students. And Game Design Workshop is the sort of undergrad introduction to game design class. In that class, you do a number of different projects, the last of which is, I think, 5 weeks. The last 5 weeks of the semester is your final game project. Robottery was the final game project for Michelle and Will and their team. Then following that class, the next semester, they brought that game to the Finish and Polish class that Jesse and I teach, and we spent 15 weeks continuing to develop, polishing, and working on, frankly, a lot of that time is spent working on the productization of the game, rather than the game design itself. The game design has to be pretty locked down in the first few weeks. of that class. So realistically, this game was designed and for the most part developed in 10 to 15 weeks over the course of a couple of different semesters, parts of a couple of different semesters. And then the rest of that time was spent putting together the Kickstarter campaign, figuring out the logistics of production, putting together a marketing campaign for the game, doing all of the ancillary stuff that takes up an enormous amount of time and energy. So this is actually a game that was developed in a quite a short span of time by students, and so it's, even though it is like really good, I think it's a really solid game. It isn't as sort of refined, I guess, as a game that goes through a much longer development cycle. And you don't really see that a lot in the play experience of the game. I think that this is, like, I want to emphasize, really, really feel like this is a very high quality game, and the experience of playing it is really high quality. But if this were an experienced team that had a year to put together this game, I think one of the things that you would see is that it would be designed to play 2 to 4 or 2 to 5 players, rather than really working at 4. Okay, I'm just gonna check and see what Michelle is saying. We tested the game early on with fewer players, found the atmosphere of the classroom with peers that support you and compete against you suffered. However, we're interested in testing it more seriously with a higher player count. Currently, the way the game is balanced is geared directly towards 4 players, and it's tough to test for more, but something that they're interested in. So I guess that's sort of what I'm saying, is that's a concession that sort of has to be made when you're creating games in this environment. They spent a lot of time really, really polishing the play experience for 4 players, at the expense of designing mechanisms in the game that would make it balanced for more or fewer. Hi, Secret Girlfriend, by the way. Do you know if any of your students follow play-by-play more or less closely? And would you like them to? I can't answer that question. That's a super loaded question. I actually don't know really how many of my students follow play-by-play closely. I do know of a few of my students who follow mostly walking, and I actually had the really exciting experience a couple of years ago of 2 of the graduate students. I think I told this story. 2 of the graduate students who came to USC, who were admitted and actually enrolled, knew me from mostly walking on the first day when we sort of introduced ourselves. And I think sort of learned about the program from me and Sean and Bill. And certainly, I do know of students who have seen play-by-play. I mean, my students are aware of it. I don't know of any students who watch it regularly, which is fine. I don't know that I need to know that. Because I think that there is a lot of value in this show. If a student watched it and got something out of it, I think that would be great. But I don't do it for my students specifically. Like, that's not my intended audience. And I certainly present differently on this show than I do in a classroom, at least at sometimes. And so that would be, it's possible that I would feel a little bit uncomfortable really thinking or confronting the fact that students that I have actively in my classroom also watch this show. Not that I want to discourage them from doing so, but I kind of have to acknowledge the separation between who I am in the role that I play in a classroom environment from who I am in the role that I play as the host of this show to viewers of it. That's all. Students cannot tip bits for grades. I do not take that into consideration when calculating grades. I want to be very clear and upfront on that point. Wouldn't you consider exposing the concept of the dragon to your students to have them do an exercise where they just have to add it to an existing game? Yeah, it's not a good fit for the Finish and Polish class because that class is about a different Roto. You get plus 1 percentage point to your grade. The scope of that class, or the focus of that class, is on the sort of latter half or latter third of the development process. It's way too late to be doing sort of to really cover the sort of early design, what I would call blue sky stage questions of brainstorming that the dragon concept is really. Hi, Secret Girlfriend, thank you. Did you watch an ad for that? Thank you. I hope it was a good ad. But I'm teaching another class in the fall that is the intro game design class for graduate students. And I do have a couple of exercises that are similar, but not specifically the dragon question or asking it in that way. So I'm going to think about that. That might... the only problem with that class is that it is so squeezed. Like, there's so much that I want to put into the intro game design class for MFAs. That at the very least, I think, could be an extra credit sort of a thing. I'm probably not going to get to do extra credit for the MFAs because they don't care about grades. I don't know. We'll see. It's a really good suggestion. It's a fantastic exercise. I'm going to think about where the right place to put it in, like if I have a place where I can put it in. Okay, I want to go back. I don't know if Michelle is still here. I don't know if Will is still here. So there is Eve asked a question about whether or not this game could be played cooperatively. And I want to go back to a suggestion that I made at one point during Finish and Polish, which was having a variant mode for the game that involved basically taking a cumulative score for everybody at the table rather than playing competitively with a single winner. And this was sort of a suggestion to try to solve a particular problem that you guys were having with the game. And you ended up finding a different solution for that problem that worked better as a solution for that problem. But I'm curious if you did any development work or any playtesting of the game in a cooperative mode. Or if you have any thoughts based on that conversation that we had a long time ago about ways that this game could be played in a cooperative mode. Yes, Michelle, the school ranking. So the way that I sort of proposed it, the way that I thought about this, would be that you would get a cumulative score as a table of 4, and that you would play the game 4 times, a total of 4 times, representing 4 years of school, of college. And then at the end of 4 games, you would total everybody's score over all 4 games, and that would give you a number that you could compare to like a table to let you know sort of how well you did in a these are the where we have to go in non-digital games to do things like leaderboards, right? In a digital game, you would just say show everybody where their final score is ranked with everybody else in the world, or with their friend group or something like that. In analog games, we have to look at prior art, like, for example, Hanabi, which is a cooperative game. Also, most single-player tabletop games have some kind of you get a score at the end, and then you look at a chart where that score sort of ranks you or rates you from, really, really good, the best that anybody could really reasonably do, to not such a great score. And that's based on sort of play testing that developers do ahead of time so that they can print that statically in a rule book that says, like, 50 is a really good score. Very few players are going to get 50. So if you get 50, that's a high ranked score, even though there's no way to like actually see dynamically how many people actually get that. Hanabi does it, I forget how Hanabi does it, but it ranks you, it gives you like a grade, like an A, B, or C, based on how many points your group is able to get. To do this in Robottery, you'd have to change the way that the professors work, so that I think professors, instead of being won by a single player, can give their points to multiple players, and then probably give bonus points based on their preferences, or something like that, or maybe preferences don't count in a cooperative game, in order to create sort of more differentiation. And that's going to give you obviously much higher scores in a cooperative game than in a competitive game, but there's more that you can work towards as a group. So, okay, I think that was enough vamping, that I gave Michelle time to actually answer the question. There was that period of time where we took sabotage out. Yeah, so sabotage wasn't working the way that they had originally implemented it. So they took sabotage out and tested a few variants where there was no sabotage. The game still played pretty well, but without the sabotage mechanic, it was missing a level of unpredictability that made the game more exciting to play. However, we never tested it with a purely cooperative aspect with the school ranking, which is something I would really love to try. We'd have to figure out some other wrenches to throw into the robot building process to keep it exciting. So that's a great point. Making the game purely cooperative takes away some of the elements that are built in there, especially sabotage as like an actual mechanic. Sabotage is in there is there to solve a problem of predictability and staleness. Also, just the fact that you are playing competitively with other people means that there's a level of tension between players, and sort of like not everybody is going to get everything that they want. Making the game cooperative would reduce those tensions. So you would want then to find ways to increase that kind of tension in different ways. That's a fantastic point, Michelle. That's not something that I had sort of that like my suggestion of, well, just make it cooperative doesn't account for how much blander the game becomes when you do that, just in the dynamics between players. So you're absolutely right. You would need to find ways to reintroduce some kind of charge or energy, and ideally not just pure randomness, but something that creates a more interesting tension between the players and the game system. Will says, I really like the idea of players in a certain play session developing a history and thereby a narrative through their gameplay. I'm thinking maybe we could introduce a story element of classes with different graduation years that compete with different classes. Yeah, I think that there are ways that you can sort of take that idea of games representing classes and do different things with it. Cool. All right, guys, thank you so much. Thanks everybody for joining Play by Play tonight, for hanging out during the Q&A. Thank you especially to Will and Michelle for sticking around and answering questions, and for playing the game with me. I had a great time. That was a lot of fun, and I'm glad that it works on Tabletop Simulator. I think it's neat that you guys have it up there, and I hope you're able to do more stuff with that. Fantastic. Summer's weird, guys. There aren't as many people around, and schedules sort of get changed. I think that there will be an after class tomorrow, but I'm not sure exactly what's going on, what we'll be playing. So stay tuned to my Twitter, and you'll get sort of more up-to-date information as the day goes on tomorrow. But we should be back next week with a full suite of shows, mostly Walking on Monday, and Play-by-Play on Thursday. And definitely check out the Kickstarter page for Robottery 101. Which is still funding. It has funded, so they're now working towards stretch goals, which include making improvements to the quality of the cards, the finish and material of the cards that actually get printed. But if you want a copy of this game, go pledge at the Kickstarter to pre-order it, and the game's done. We've produced test copies. You saw it played tonight. It's ready to go. As soon as the Kickstarter completes, they will be ordering. They'll be fulfilling all of those orders, so you'll get it in a more reasonable time frame than a lot of Kickstarters can promise you. So if it looked fun, if you enjoyed the beautiful art, or the really cool premise and mechanics of the game, then check it out. I think that's it. Thanks everybody. Have a great night. I'll see you later.